Arthur Vance, the billionaire CEO of Omnicure, stood on stage as a titan of industry, a man who sold miracles in a bottle. To the world, he was a savior. But beneath the $1,000 suit and confident smile, a terrifying secret was unfolding. His own body was turning against him, racked by the very same agonizing side effects his best-selling drug was designed to hide. As he fought to control the tremor in his hand, a small, quiet voice cut through the applause. It was a 10-year-old girl, named Lily, and her words struck him like lightning. "Sir, your body is telling the truth that your mouth won't." Vance laughed, mocking the little girl in front of hundreds of journalists. The room laughed with him until she was led away, and the impossible happened right before their eyes, turning their laughter into a stunned, supernatural silence. This is just the tip of the iceberg. To find out how this impossible story ends, subscribe to the channel and turn on notifications. You won't want to miss what comes next. The auditorium was a cathedral built to worship the god of modern medicine, and its high priest was Arthur Vance. His face, 10 feet tall and beaming with philanthropic warmth, looked down from a dozen screens. On stage, the real Arthur Vance felt significantly smaller. The applause washed over him, a tidal wave of adoration from journalists, investors, and industry leaders who had all grown rich from the gospel of his company, Omnicure. They were there to celebrate the launch of his new charitable foundation, another calculated move to solidify his image as a savior. He gripped the sleek, minimalist podium, his knuckles white. The wood felt like an anchor in a raging sea. To the world, he was the picture of health and success, the living embodiment of the promise sold in every bottle of Vitanova, his company's billion-dollar blockbuster drug. Vitanova promised energy, clarity, a life free from the aches and pains of aging. It was a lie. Arthur knew it was a lie because a strange invisible fire was currently burning through his own nervous system. It started as a faint tremor in his right hand, a phantom vibration he could easily hide in his pocket. Then came the creeping fog in his mind, moments where words would vanish from his memory right before he spoke them. Now, it was a constant battle, a war fought within the confines of his own skin. "Omnicure is more than a company," he said, his voice resonating with practiced confidence, a sound that belied the faint metallic taste in his mouth. "It is a promise that tomorrow will be healthier, stronger, and brighter than today. Our flagship product, Vitanova, has already delivered on that promise for millions." The applause was automatic, deafening. He smiled, a perfectly crafted expression that didn't reach his eyes. His vision blurred for a second, the faces in the crowd melting into indistinct smudges of color. He blinked hard, blaming the stage lights. It was always the stage lights, the lack of sleep, the pressure. It was never the truth. He concluded his speech with a flourish, announcing a $10 billion endowment for global health initiatives. The room erupted. This was the headline they came for. This was Arthur Vance, the benevolent king, securing his legacy. He opened the floor to questions, a performance of transparency he had perfected over the years. The first few were softballs from friendly publications, praising his generosity. Asking about Omnicure's future, he answered them easily, the corporate-approved words flowing from him as if by instinct. Then, a hand went up in the third row. It wasn't a journalist. It was a child, a girl, no older than 10, with dark, serious eyes that seemed to absorb all the light in the room. She stood on her chair to reach the microphone, her small frame a stark contrast to the grandiosity of the event. A murmur went through the crowd. Security guards shifted their weight, unsure of what to do. Arthur felt a flash of irritation. This was a breach, a crack in the perfect facade of the morning. He gestured magnanimously, a king allowing an unusual petition from a commoner. "It seems we have a future investigative journalist in our midst," he said, drawing a polite laugh from the audience. "Go ahead, young lady. What's your question?" The girl didn't smile. Her gaze was unwavering, and when she spoke, her voice was clear and calm, cutting through the vast space with unnerving precision. She did not ask a question. She made a statement. "Mr. Vance," she began, "my name is Lily. I don't have a question." She paused, letting the silence hang in the air. "Your body is telling the truth that your mouth won't. The shaking in your hands, the confusion you try to hide. It's the medicine. It's the Vitanova." The room fell dead silent. The air crackled with tension. Every eye darted between the giant on the stage and the small girl in the crowd. Arthur's heart hammered against his ribs. It felt like a physical blow. How could she know it was impossible? He was a master of concealment. Lily continued, her voice never rising, yet it seemed to fill every corner of the auditorium. "I can help you," she said simply. "But for the real cure to work, you have to tell the truth first." For a single, terrifying moment, Arthur Vance was speechless. The carefully constructed world around him seemed to fracture, but decades of ruthless ambition and public manipulation took over. The fear was instantly replaced by a cold, searing rage. This child wasn't a prophet. She was an attack, a threat to be neutralized. A cruel, dismissive smile formed on his lips as he leaned into the microphone, ready to utterly destroy the little girl who dared to challenge him in his own kingdom. Arthur Vance's mind, a finely tuned machine for risk assessment and public relations, processed the girl's accusation in a nanosecond. The first wave was pure, cold shock, a jolt that threatened to buckle his knees, but it was immediately followed by a surge of adrenaline that sharpened his senses. This was not a personal crisis. It was a hostile takeover of his narrative. His entire empire was built on a foundation of absolute control, and this child, Lily, had just placed a stick of dynamite at its core. He would not let her light the fuse. His face softened into a mask of practiced pity, a look he had perfected for board members who questioned his methods. He let out a soft chuckle, shaking his head as if dealing with a precocious but deeply misguided toddler. The audience, sensing their cue, relaxed. The tension in the room eased, replaced by anticipation. They were about to witness the lion gently put a lamb back in its place. "Oh, my dear," Arthur said, his voice dripping with condescension. "That's a very heavy burden for such young shoulders. Vita Nova, the medicine. These are very big, very complicated ideas." He walked around the podium, creating the illusion of intimacy, of a wise elder speaking to a student. "It's wonderful that you're so passionate, but sometimes people who don't understand the science can get confused, frightened even. Did someone tell you to say these things? Perhaps your parents read something on the internet?" He let the insinuation hang in the air. He wasn't just dismissing her. He was expertly reframing her as a puppet, a mouthpiece for unseen, malicious actors. The journalists scribbled furiously. The narrative was shifting. The headline was no longer "CEO's health questioned by child," but "Omnicure CEO target of bizarre smear campaign." Lily did not flinch. Her expression remained unchanged, her dark eyes fixed on him. She wasn't angry or scared. She looked disappointed. That look unnerved him more than any accusation. It felt like a judgment. He pressed his advantage, his voice rising with theatrical indignation. "You know we are here today," he said, gesturing to the gleaming logos of his new foundation, "to pledge billions of dollars to the health of children all over the world. To see a child here in this room being used as a pawn in a corporate game, it's not just sad, it's a tragedy." The room was his again. Nods of agreement rippled through the crowd. The quiet chuckles turned into supportive applause. They were applauding his strength, his grace under pressure. They were applauding the king for banishing the ghost from the machine. He signaled to his head of security, a mountain of a man named Marcus, who stood near the wall. The signal was subtle, a slight dip of the head. Marcus and another guard began to move down the aisle. They were large, imposing men, their suits barely containing their bulk, yet they moved with a strange reluctance. As they approached her, Lily showed no fear. She didn't cry or shrink away. She simply looked at the men, then turned her gaze back to Arthur one last time. She didn't need to be removed. She was already prepared to leave. She handed the microphone back to a stunned event coordinator and walked into the aisle to meet the guards. As they flanked her, escorting her toward the exit, she stopped for a brief moment. She turned her head, and her eyes locked with Arthur's across the cavernous room. There was no sound, no grand gesture, but in the silent space between them, Arthur felt something shift. It was as if she had spoken a single word directly into the center of his soul, a word of prayer, a prayer for truth. The effect was not gradual. It was instantaneous, it was violent. One moment the fire was raging in his nerves, the next it was extinguished. The tremor in his hand didn't just stop, it was replaced by a feeling of profound stillness and strength. The fog in his mind didn't just lift, It was blasted away by a wave of crystalline clarity, so intense it almost brought him to his knees. The colors in the room exploded into vibrant, hyper-real hues. The muted hum of the air conditioning became a symphony of distinct mechanical parts. He could feel the fine wool of his suit against his skin, the solid leather of his shoes on the floor, the steady, powerful beat of his own heart. It was a perfect 60-second restoration. He felt not just better, but whole, more alive than he had been in a decade. His jaw went slack. The condescending smile vanished from his face, replaced by a raw, unfiltered expression of pure shock. He stared at the empty doorway, through which Lily had just disappeared. The applause from the audience faltered, sputtered, and died. His transformation was so sudden, so total, that everyone could see it. The king's mask had fallen, and behind it was a man who had just seen a ghost, or God. The room, which moments before had been filled with derisive laughter, was now submerged in a thick, eerie silence. All that could be heard was the faint whir of cameras trying to capture the look of utter bewilderment on Arthur Vance's face. The perfect minute was a lifetime. It was an eternity of peace, and then it was over. It began as a ghost, a faint flutter in the muscles of his right pinky finger, a memory of the tremor. Then it returned, a familiar enemy, shaking his hand with renewed vengeance. The fog rolled back into his mind, thicker and more suffocating than before. A spike of pain shot through his temple. The vibrant colors of the room bled back into their dull, ordinary shades. The miracle was gone. Arthur Vance realized with a surge of cold, nauseating panic that he hadn't just humiliated a little girl. He had mocked, dismissed, and banished the only real cure in the universe. The silence in the auditorium was a living thing, a heavy blanket that smothered all thought. For Arthur Vance, it was the sound of his world ending. The return of his symptoms was not a gentle fading, but a violent reclamation. The tremor ripped through his hand with the force of an electric shock. The blinding pain in his skull returned, as if a hot spike had been driven into his temple. The perfect crystalline clarity of his mind shattered into a million disoriented pieces. He was a castaway who had been allowed to touch dry land for a single minute before being thrown back into a freezing, merciless ocean. He stared blankly at the sea of faces, his mouth half open. The teleprompter still showed his closing remarks, but the words were a meaningless jumble of letters. His mind was screaming a single frantic question: his public relations. Director, a sharp woman named Evelyn, began speaking into his earpiece, her voice a frantic buzz of instructions. "Arthur, say something. Wrap it up. Smile. We need to get you out of there, now." With an almost superhuman effort, he wrestled his body back under some semblance of control. He blinked, forcing a grotesque caricature of his usual smile onto his face. "Thank you," he stammered, his voice sounding thin and alien to his own ears. "Thank you all for coming." He turned abruptly, without her, waiting for the final round of applause, and walked off the stage with a stiff, unnatural gait. He didn't see the explosion of activity he left in his wake, the journalists leaping to their feet, shouting questions, the bewildered investors turning to each other, the low hum of confusion escalating into a roar of frantic speculation. All he could see was the dark, welcoming void of the backstage area. The moment he was out of sight, his composure disintegrated. He stumbled, catching himself. Against a wall, his breath coming in ragged gasps. Evelyn and his team rushed to his side, their faces a mixture of fear and concern. "Arthur, what happened? Are you ill? Was it a stroke?" Evelyn asked, her voice low and urgent. Arthur couldn't answer. He couldn't explain that he had just experienced 60 seconds of perfect health, a divine intervention, only to have it ripped away. How could he tell them that the source of this miracle was not a new drug or a medical procedure, but a 10-year-old girl he had just publicly brutalized? To admit that would be to admit madness. To admit that his entire life's work, his belief in science and control, was a fragile house of cards. "Get Marcus," he snarled, pushing past his anxious aides. He locked himself in his private green room, a space designed for calm reflection that now felt like a prison cell. He stared at his reflection in the large vanity mirror. The man looking back was a stranger, a pale, terrified ghost, wearing his face. He held up his right hand and watched it tremble, the motion violent and uncontrollable. It was a visible manifestation of his loss of control, a mockery of the power he projected to the world. For one perfect minute, that hand had been still. The memory of it was an agonizing torture. The desert of doubt he now found himself in was not about whether the event was real. He knew with a certainty that terrified him that it was. The doubt was about everything else. If a little girl's prayer could momentarily cure him, what did that say about the billions he'd invested in research and development? If the truth could heal, what did that say about the profitable lies upon which his empire was built? He felt the foundations of his reality cracking beneath his feet. The world was no longer a predictable, manageable system of inputs and outputs. It was a place of terrifying, inexplicable power that he had no dominion over. His head of security, Marcus, entered the room without knocking. His normally stoic face was etched with concern. "Sir, the press is in a frenzy. We need to issue a statement. Dehydration, low blood sugar." Arthur spun around, his eyes wild. "Forget the statement," he yelled, sweeping a tray of untouched gourmet snacks off a table. The porcelain shattered on the floor. "Find her." "The girl." Marcus looked confused. "Sir, the girl who asked the question?" Security escorted her and her mother from the premises. "I don't care," Arthur roared, advancing. On the larger man. "I want her found. I want to know everything about her. Her name, her address, where she goes to school, what she eats for breakfast. I want her found before the sun sets today. Use every resource we have. Facial recognition from the press pool cameras, traffic cams outside the building. Cross-reference the event's registration list. I don't care what it costs or what lines you have to cross. Find her." The order was unhinged, obsessive, but Marcus recognized the steel underneath the panic. This wasn't a request. It was the only thing that mattered in the world. He nodded grimly. "I'm on it, sir." For the rest of the day, Arthur was a caged animal. He paced the length of his penthouse office, the glittering city skyline a blur he didn't see. He ignored hundreds of calls and urgent messages. The stock price of Omnicure was plummeting based on rumors of his failing health, but he couldn't bring himself to care. The only thing that felt real was the memory of that 1 minute of peace and the agonizing, ever-worsening symptoms that served as a constant reminder of what he had lost. His tremor was now so pronounced he couldn't hold a pen, let alone sign a document. The mental fog was so thick he found himself losing his train of thought mid-sentence while pacing alone in his office. He was a king whose body was actively seceding from his own rule. Hours later, as dusk painted the city in shades of orange and purple, Marcus returned. He stood in the doorway of Arthur's office, holding a single manila folder. His expression was grim, unreadable. "You found her?" Arthur asked, his voice a hoarse whisper. Marcus nodded, walking slowly toward the desk. He placed the folder down, but didn't open it. There was a strange hesitation in his manner, a reluctance Arthur had never seen in the man before. "What is it?" Arthur demanded. "What's her name?" Marcus took a deep breath, his gaze heavy. He looked his boss directly in the eye, his voice low and steady, delivering a piece of information that would hit Arthur Vance with the force of a physical blow. "We found her, sir," Marcus said. "Her name is Lily Croft. Her father, he was Dr. Alistair Croft." The name struck Arthur Vance with the force of a physical impact. Alistair Croft. A ghost he had buried years ago under a mountain of money, legal documents, and lies. The sound of it in the quiet of his penthouse office was a judgment, an echo from a past he had convinced himself was sealed. The folder on the desk seemed to pulse with a dark energy, a coffin containing the body of his greatest sin. His tremor, which had become a constant, violent companion, suddenly intensified, shaking his entire arm. A sharp, blinding pain, the familiar spike of his illness, shot through his skull and he gripped the edge of his desk to keep from falling. He didn't need to open the folder. He knew the story. As Marcus stood in stoic silence, the years melted away, and the memories Arthur had so carefully suppressed came flooding back. He remembered Alistair Croft not as a name on a legal file, but as a man, a brilliant, absurdly idealistic scientist with a passion that bordered on naive. Croft was the true genius behind Vitanova, the architect of its core compound, and he was the man who had tried to stop it. Arthur remembered the meeting vividly. It was in this very office. Croft, his face pale with earnest fear, had spread out the data on the long mahogany table. The data showed a clear, terrifying pattern in the final stage trials. While Vitanova provided a short-term boost, long-term use led to progressive neurological decay. It caused tremors, cognitive fog, chronic pain. It was a slow-acting poison disguised as a miracle. Croft had begged him, "We have to delay, Arthur. We have to reformulate. We can't release this. It's not safe." But Arthur didn't see data. He saw profit margins. He saw the stock price, the magazine covers, the legacy. He saw the throne that was waiting for him, and Alistair Croft was standing in his way. So Arthur had made a choice. He didn't just overrule Croft, he decided to erase him. The memory of his own ruthlessness made him sick. He remembered the cold precision of the attack. He'd fired Croft, citing gross incompetence and falsified data. He'd leaked a carefully crafted story to a friendly journalist about an unstable scientist trying to sabotage the company. He'd used Omnicure's army of lawyers to bind Croft in a web of non-disclosure agreements so tight he couldn't even whisper the truth to his own wife without facing financial ruin. He had taken a good, brilliant man and professionally, publicly, and personally destroyed him. The last he had heard, months later, was a brief internal memo noting that Croft had died of a sudden, stress-induced heart attack. At the time, Arthur had felt a flicker of something. Not guilt, but relief. A loose end had been tied up. Now, standing in his office, that loose end had unraveled and was wrapped tightly around his neck, choking him. The illness wasn't just an illness, it was a curse. It was Croft's data made flesh. It was justice, of a kind so poetic it could only be divine. "The address," Arthur whispered, his voice hoarse. "Give me the address." The drive to the apartment building was a descent into hell. His gleaming limousine, a symbol of his untouchable status, slid through streets in a part of the city he hadn't visited in 20 years. This was not the world of steel and glass towers. It was a world of brick buildings, of fire escapes and corner stores. The world where real people lived and suffered. As the car pulled up to a modest, clean but clearly aging building, Arthur felt a profound sense of dread. He was a murderer returning to the scene of the crime years later to find the victim's family held the key to his own life. He walked into the lobby and rode the slow, groaning elevator to the 4th floor. Each floor number that lit up felt like another circle of his own personal inferno. He found the apartment 4B and stood before the simple wooden door, his hand shaking too violently to even attempt to knock. He used his left hand to rap weakly on the door. It was opened by a woman in her late 40s. She was tired but with a quiet dignity about her. He recognized her from Croft's employee file. Sarah Croft. Her eyes widened for a fraction of a second in recognition, a flicker of old pain. But it was quickly replaced by something else, a cold, weary resignation. There was no shock. It was as if she had been expecting him for years. "Mr. Vance," she said, her voice devoid of emotion. "I always wondered if you'd ever show up at our door." She let him in without another word. The apartment was small but immaculate. A gallery of family photos lined the hallway wall. In every picture, Alistair Croft was smiling, his arm around his wife or his young daughter. The man Arthur had turned into a villain lived on in these frames as a hero. On a small end table sat a framed photo of Alistair by himself, a simple black ribbon tied around the corner of the frame. And then he saw her, Lily. She was sitting at the small kitchen table, drawing in a coloring book, as if the monster who had destroyed her family had not just walked into her home. She looked up at him, her dark eyes just as calm and knowing as they had been in the auditorium. She didn't smile. She didn't frown. She just watched him. Her presence was a silent, deafening accusation. "What do you want?" Sarah asked, her voice cutting through his stupor. "Help," Arthur croaked, the word tasting like ash in his mouth. "Your daughter. She did something. At the press conference. I need her help." Sarah let out a single bitter laugh. "My daughter," she said, her voice trembling with years of suppressed rage. "You think this is about you? You think she performed some kind of party trick for your benefit?" She stepped closer, her eyes flashing. "For years after you destroyed my husband, after he died of a broken heart, we had nothing. I prayed for justice. I prayed for revenge. But Lily, she only ever prayed for one thing. She would kneel by her bed every single night and pray that the world would know that her father was a good man. She prayed for his truth to be seen. She pointed a shaking finger at Arthur. That miracle you felt? That minute of peace in your rotting body? That wasn't for you. That was the answer to my daughter's prayer. It was the universe showing you Alistair's truth by writing it into your own flesh. The disease you're suffering from isn't some random tragedy. It is my husband's research, come to life inside of you. The air left Arthur's lungs. The floor seemed to drop out from under him. The search for a cure was a fool's errand. He was not sick. He was haunted. He was not the patient. He was the disease. He looked at the photo of the smiling scientist, then at the quiet, solemn little girl at the table. He hadn't come here seeking a cure for his body. He had arrived at the scene of the crime to beg for a cure for his soul. Sarah Croft's words were not just an accusation, they were a verdict. And with that verdict, the last pillar holding up Arthur Vance's world crumbled into dust. The strength evaporated from his limbs, and the billionaire CEO, the titan of industry, collapsed onto the worn linoleum floor of the small apartment. He landed hard on his knees, the impact jarring his bones. But he barely felt it. The physical pain was a dull, distant echo of the cataclysm unfolding within his soul. He was not just a sick man. He was a poison. He was not just a liar. His very existence was a lie. He looked up at Sarah, his face a ruin of sweat and despair. The carefully constructed mask of power was gone, shattered completely, leaving only the terrified, pathetic man underneath. All the years of ruthless ambition, of boardroom battles won and enemies crushed, of accumulating wealth and influence beyond measure, all of it amounted to nothing in this small room, under the gaze of the woman whose life he had destroyed. His body shook with a tremor so violent it was a convulsion, a physical manifestation of his soul's agony. "I did it," he whispered, the words tearing from his throat, raw and broken. It was not a calculated admission, it was a surrender. All of it. I did it all. A confession, ugly and unfiltered, poured out of him. He told her everything. He spoke of his jealousy of Alistair's brilliance, of his fear that the Vitanova data would sink the company on the eve of its biggest triumph. He described in shameful detail the smear campaign, the lawyers, the lies he'd told to the board and to the world. He even confessed the darkest truth, the moment he heard of Alistair's death and felt a cold, calculated sense of relief. He wept, not with self-pity, but with the sheer, crushing weight of his own monstrosity. He emptied himself of all the poison he had, carried for years, leaving him hollowed out on the floor of his victim's home. Sarah Croft listened, her arms crossed, her expression a storm of conflicting emotions. The raw fury that had sustained her for years warred with the sight of the pathetic, broken creature before her. This was not the powerful monster she had imagined confronting in her darkest moments. This was just a man, drowning in his own guilt, his immense wealth as useless as a handful of sand in the face of his self-inflicted damnation. Her anger did not vanish, but it subsided, leaving behind a vast, empty landscape of grief and pity. She offered no words of comfort, no absolution. She simply bore witness to his unraveling, her silence a more profound judgment than any shout could ever be. When Arthur's confession finally subsided into ragged, choked sobs, the apartment fell silent again. The only sounds were his gasping breaths and the gentle hum of the refrigerator. The power in the room had shifted so completely. It was a tangible force. Arthur Vance, the man who moved markets and swayed governments with a single phone call, was now utterly powerless. He had nothing to offer, nothing to threaten. He was a beggar, stripped bare, his fate resting in the hands of the family he had wronged. It was then that Lily moved. She slid off her chair at the kitchen table, her coloring book forgotten. She walked over and stood a few feet away from where Arthur knelt, a broken heap on the floor. She did not look at him with anger, nor with pity. Her gaze was as calm and clear as it had been in the auditorium. She was not a child looking at a monster. She was a guide, looking at a lost soul. Arthur looked up at her through his tears, his vision blurred. In that moment, she seemed to him the most powerful person on earth. She was the keeper of the miracle, the arbiter of the cure he so desperately craved. "Please," he begged, his voice the broken whisper of a child. "Help me. What do I do?" Lily looked from him to the photograph of her smiling father on the wall, and then back to him. Her expression did not change, but her voice carried a weight that defied her years. It was not a voice of accusation, but one of simple, immutable fact. "The truth healed you for 1 minute," she said, her words precise and clear. "Only the whole truth can heal you forever." Her statement was not an offer, it was a path. A terrifying, impossible path. Arthur understood immediately. This was not about a secret, apology or a quiet donation to a charity in Alistair's name. This was about a public reckoning. He stared at her, the full implication of her words crashing down on him. His company, his legacy, his freedom. It was all on the line. He, Arthur Vance, would have to be the one to tell the world about the monster he was. Lily tilted her head, as if sensing his terror and doubt. She gave him no room to negotiate with his conscience. She gave him the first and only instruction on his path to redemption. "You buried my father's truth under a mountain of lies," she said, her voice soft but unyielding. "Now you have to dig it up. Go and tell them. Tell all of them what you did and what he knew." Arthur Vance left the Crofts' apartment like a man walking away from his own grave. The short journey down the groaning elevator and through the humble lobby felt like a mile-long walk of shame. When he stepped outside, the city air, thick with the scent of rain and exhaust, felt different. The world he had once owned now seemed alien and menacing. He slid into the plush leather interior of his limousine, a silent, air-conditioned tomb, and the stark contrast between his world and theirs hit him with the force of a physical blow. He had just left a home filled with the ghosts of his crimes, and now he was returning to the castle he had built with the spoils. He did not feel cleansed. He did not feel redeemed. He felt terrified. Lily's final words echoed in his mind, not as a gentle suggestion, but as an absolute terrifying command. It was a death sentence for the man known as Arthur Vance. To obey would mean the complete annihilation of his life's work, his reputation, and his freedom. To disobey would mean abandoning the only glimmer of hope he had for his soul. As the limousine sliced through the city traffic, his phone, which had been silent on the journey there, began to vibrate incessantly. A cascade of notifications lit up the screen, dozens of missed calls, from his COO, his lead counsel, and every member of the OmniCure board. 100 frantic text messages. He ignored them, the digital screams of his burning empire feeling distant and irrelevant. But when he finally reached his penthouse, Evelyn, his sharp-witted PR director, was waiting for him, her face pale and drawn. "Arthur, thank God," she said, her usual unflappable demeanor gone. "It's a catastrophe. The board has called an emergency meeting for tomorrow morning. They're invoking the medical fitness clause in your contract. They're ousting you, Arthur. They're going to paint you as unstable and take control of the company." The news should have felt like a betrayal, a final stab in the back. But instead, Arthur just felt a strange sense of inevitability. Of course they were. The machine he had built was simply doing what it was designed to do, protect itself at all costs, even if it meant devouring its creator. His legal team was already assembled in his office. A war. Counsel preparing for battle. They laid out the strategy, the familiar, ruthless playbook he himself had written. "We fight them, Arthur," his lead lawyer, a man named Sterling, said with cold confidence. "We get 3 of the top neurologists in the country to declare you fit for duty. We claim corporate espionage, that the girl was a plant. We go on the offensive. We can leak the board members' own dirty laundry. We can crush this before it even begins." It was the voice of his past, the voice of the old Arthur Vance. A voice of power, control, and calculated aggression. It offered him a lifeline, a path back to his throne. He could survive this. He could win. All he had to do was lie. All he had to do was become the man he was yesterday. He could keep his kingdom, but he would have to bury Alistair Croft's truth a second time, burying his own soul along with it. For a long moment, he stood at the vast window of his office, looking down at the city spread below him like a circuit. Bored of glittering lights, it was his city, his kingdom, everything he had ever wanted. He saw the magazine covers on his wall, his face smiling under headlines that called him a visionary, a titan, a healer. It was all a lie, a magnificent, beautiful lie that had cost him everything that mattered. He thought of the look in Sarah Croft's eyes, the years of pain and anger. He thought of the photo of the smiling, brilliant scientist he had destroyed out of pure greed. And most of all, he Thought of the 60 seconds of perfect, impossible peace. That 1 minute of clarity was more real, more valuable, than all the billions in his bank account, all the towers that bore his name. It was the only thing that was true. His hands began to tremble again, the familiar fire returning to his nerves, a stark reminder of the price of his lies. The path Lily had shown him was an execution. It meant walking willingly into his own ruin. The path his lawyers offered was survival. It meant living the rest of his life in a prison of his own making, his body and soul rotting from the inside out. He was standing at the ultimate crossroads, and the choice was between two kinds of death. He turned away from the window, away from the glittering, false promise of his kingdom. He looked at his team of lawyers and advisors, the architects of his lies, and he saw them for what they were. They were not his saviors. They were his co-conspirators. He felt a profound sense of calm settle over him. It was not the miraculous peace he had felt before, but something quieter, deeper. It was the calm of a man who had finally, after a lifetime of running, decided to stop. He walked past his stunned legal team and picked up his desk phone. Sterling smiled, assuming Arthur was calling in the reinforcements to begin the fight. "Who are we calling first?" he asked, ready for war. Arthur ignored him. He dialed the number for his PR director. Evelyn answered on the first ring, her voice tense. "Arthur?" His voice, when he spoke, was steady and clear, devoid of the tremor that had plagued it for so long. He had made his choice. "Evelyn," he said, his tone resolute and final. "Cancel my appointments for tomorrow and book the Grand Imperial Ballroom. Call a full press conference for 10 a.m. I have a new announcement to make. It's about Vitanova." The Grand Imperial Ballroom was not a conference hall. It was a coliseum, and the assembled press were there for a blood sport. The air was thick with the scent of ambition and imminent disaster. Every major news outlet in the world was present, their cameras poised like cannons, ready to broadcast the fall of a titan. The board of directors of Omnicure sat in the front row, their faces grim and resolute, looking like a tribunal ready to pass sentence. The consensus was unanimous. Arthur Vance, the cornered lion, was about to go on the attack in the most spectacular and desperate corporate battle of the decade. They were all expecting a war. Arthur Vance was there to offer a surrender. He walked onto the stage alone. There was no entourage, no team of lawyers flanking him. He moved with a slow, deliberate pace, his body still a battleground of symptoms. The tremor in his hand was visible to everyone, and he made no effort to hide it. He didn't grip the podium for support. He simply rested his hands upon it, letting his weakness be seen. He looked out at the sea of faces, not with the defiance of a king, but with the quiet resignation of a man who had already accepted his fate. The room, which had been buzzing with speculation, slowly fell into a tense, expectant silence. He was not the man they were expecting. Arthur leaned into the microphone, his eyes scanning the crowd before finding the stony faces of his board members in the front row. "Good morning," he began, his voice clear, steady, and devoid of its usual booming arrogance. "I understand there has been a great deal of speculation regarding my health and the board's recent actions. They are right to be concerned. They are right to question my fitness to lead this company." A wave of shock rippled through the room. This was not the opening salvo of a war. It sounded like a concession. Sterling, his lawyer, watched from the wings, his face a mask of disbelief. The board members exchanged confused glances. Arthur continued, his gaze unwavering. "But they are concerned for the wrong reasons. My illness is not the cause of my unfitness. It is the symptom of it. My true disease is not in my nervous system, it is in my soul. And it began years ago with the man I betrayed. I'm here today to talk about Dr. Alistair Croft." The name meant nothing to the press, but to the board members, it was a thunderclap. Their faces went pale. This was a ghost they had all agreed to keep buried. Arthur now had the room's absolute, undivided attention. With a calm that felt almost supernatural, he began to tell the truth. He laid out the whole, ugly story, piece by painful piece. He spoke of Croft's genius, his integrity, and his terrifying discovery about Vitanova's long-term effects. He held up a copy of Croft's original suppressed report for all the cameras to see, and then he turned the weapon of his confession upon himself. "Dr. Croft brought this data to me," Arthur said, his voice heavy with a shame that was years overdue. "He pleaded with me. He gave me a choice between doing what was right and what was profitable, and I Made the wrong choice. I chose profits over people. I chose my legacy over your safety. I looked at his truth and I decided to bury it under a mountain of lies. He didn't spare himself a single detail. He confessed to firing Croft, to orchestrating the smear campaign, to blacklisting him from the industry. He spoke of the web of legal threats he had used to silence a good man. His voice cracked with emotion only once, when he spoke of Croft's death. "He died of a broken heart," Arthur said, his voice barely a whisper. "A heart that I broke, and I want to say to his family who may be watching that I am sorry. I am sorry for my unforgivable sin against a man who was better than I could ever hope to be." The confession was a nuclear bomb detonating in the center of the global pharmaceutical industry. The journalists were in a frenzy, a chaotic symphony of clicking cameras and frantic typing. The board members were frozen in their seats, their faces ashen, realizing that he wasn't just committing professional suicide. He was executing the entire company live on global television. Arthur took a deep breath, preparing for his final act. "Effective immediately, I am announcing a full voluntary worldwide recall of Vitanova. I am resigning my position as CEO and chairman of Omnicure, and I have instructed my assistants to deliver my full, unredacted testimony, along with all of Dr. Croft's original research, to the Food and Drug Administration and the Department of Justice." He had done it. He had sacrificed everything: his fortune, his company, his reputation, his freedom. He had laid his entire life on the altar of truth and set it on fire. As the room erupted into absolute chaos, a strange and profound stillness settled over Arthur. The deafening roar of the reporters, the flashing of 1,000 cameras, the looks of horror on the faces of his former colleagues. It all seemed to fade into a distant, muted hum. The crushing weight that he had carried on his shoulders for years, the weight of his lies and his guilt simply had dissolved. He was no longer a king. He was no longer a CEO. He was just a man, stripped of everything. And in that nothingness, he found a sense of peace that all his billions could never buy. As the empire he had built collapsed into ruin around him, for the first time in his life, Arthur Vance felt completely and utterly free. And in the sudden, quiet space of his soul, he felt the fire in his nerves begin to cool. The chaos in the ballroom was absolute, a vortex of shouting voices and flashing lights. But for Arthur Vance, standing at the podium, the world had gone perfectly silent and still. He was the eye of his own hurricane. The act of total, world-shattering confession had not left him empty as he'd expected. Instead, it had created a vacuum into which something new was rushing, something clean and quiet and whole. He felt it begin as a gentle coolness at the base of his skull, where the worst of the chronic, burning pain always resided. It was the antithesis of the fire that had tormented him for so long. It was a wave of pure, liquid peace that began to flow outward, down his spine, along the tangled, inflamed pathways of his nervous system. Where it passed, it soothed, it healed, it restored. He looked down at his right hand, the hand that had become a symbol of his loss of control, the traitorous part of himself that revealed his secret decay. He fully expected to see it shaking, uncontrollably in the aftermath of such a stressful ordeal, but it was perfectly, utterly still. Not the rigid, forced stillness of a man trying to suppress a tremor, but a deep, natural calm. He slowly lifted it in front of his face, turning it over, marveling at it. He flexed his fingers one by one. The movement was fluid, precise and strong. He made a fist, feeling the effortless power in his grip, a sensation he had thought was lost to him forever. The tremor was gone, the fog in his mind, the constant, suffocating blanket of confusion, vanished in an instant. It was as if a switch had been flipped, and the dim, flickering light bulb of his consciousness had been replaced by a brilliant, blazing sun. The clarity was blinding. The names, dates, and details that had been slipping through his grasp for months came rushing back. He could remember the exact wording of a clause on page 87 of the Vitanova patent filing. He could remember the name of the waiter who had served him coffee that morning. His mind, his greatest asset, had been returned to him, sharper and more focused than ever before. His head of security, Marcus, finally pushed through the frenzied wall of reporters to reach the stage. He had come to escort a broken man, to shield him from the fallout of his own self-immolation. But the man he found was not broken. Arthur turned to look at him, and Marcus stopped dead in his tracks. The wild, haunted look in his boss's eyes was gone. The pale, sickly complexion had been replaced by a healthy, natural color. Arthur Vance stood taller, not with the arrogance of a king, but with the quiet, unshakable posture of a man at peace with himself. "Sir?" Marcus asked, his voice full of disbelief. Arthur gave him a small, weary smile. It was the first genuine smile he had worn in years. "It's over, Marcus," he said, and the words held a double meaning that resonated in the quiet space between them. The lie was over, and so was the illness. He was escorted through a back exit to a quiet holding room. To await the arrival of the federal authorities, he had effectively summoned himself. He sat in a simple chair, the sounds of the pandemonium outside fading to a distant murmur. There were no lawyers, no advisors, no frantic phone calls. For the first time in his adult life, he was completely and utterly alone, and he had never felt less lonely. He finally understood the nature of the miracle. It wasn't a transaction. It wasn't a reward for a good deed. The healing was not the of his confession. The confession, the healing. His disease had been the physical manifestation of his lie, a cancer of the soul that had metastasized into the cells of his body. The moment he excised the lie with the clean, sharp blade of the truth, the disease had no place left to live. It simply evaporated. The cure was not divine intervention from an outside force. It was the simple, terrifying, and beautiful law of cause and effect. On a television screen, in the corner of the room, he saw his own face. The headline beneath it screamed, "Titan Falls. Omnicure CEO confesses to massive fraud. Company stock ceases trading." The old Arthur would have seen his life's work turning to ash, the ultimate failure. The new Arthur saw only justice. He felt no regret for the empire he had lost. The only thing he felt was a profound sense of gratitude for the man who had, in the end, saved him. Dr. Alistair Croft. Sitting in the quiet room, a future of courtrooms, trials, and likely a prison cell awaiting him, Arthur Vance felt no fear. He had lost the world, but he had regained himself, and for the first time, he wasn't thinking about what he had lost. He was thinking about what he could build with the truth Alistair Croft had died to protect. 2 years later, the name Arthur Vance no longer inspired awe or commanded respect in the high circles of finance and power. It was a footnote in business history, a cautionary tale whispered in boardrooms and taught in ethics classes. After his confession, the fallout had been swift and total. Omnicure, unable to survive the scandal, was dismantled, its assets liquidated to help pay for the damage it had caused. A massive compensation fund was established for the tens of thousands of victims of Vitanova, and Arthur Vance, after pleading guilty to a litany of federal charges, had traded his penthouse for a cell in a minimum security prison. He served 18 months. He lost his fortune, his company, and his freedom. By every worldly measure, he had lost everything. But on a bright, cool autumn afternoon, the man who walked through the gates of the prison was not the man who had walked in. He was thinner, older, with lines of humility etched around his eyes where arrogance once lived. But he walked without a tremor. His mind was sharp, and for the first time since he was a young man, his conscience was clear. He owned nothing but the simple suit of clothes he wore, and he had never felt richer. The new Arthur Vance did not try to disappear or hide from his past. Instead, he owned it. Using the small portion of his funds that were not seized by the government or paid out in lawsuits, he established a small, non-profit organization. He called it the Croft Foundation for Scientific Ethics. It wasn't a gleaming tower of glass and steel. It operated out of a modest, rented office space above a bookstore. Its mission was not to create new drugs, but to protect the truth. The foundation provided legal support for whistleblowers in the medical industry and advocated for greater transparency in clinical trials. Arthur, the man who once silenced a scientist, now dedicated his life to making sure no voice like Alistair Croft's would ever be silenced again. He spent his days giving lectures to medical students, his own story a powerful, real-world lesson on the seductive nature of greed. He used his intimate knowledge of the system's dark machinery to teach the next generation how to resist it. He was not celebrated, nor was he seeking applause. He was simply doing the work, one day at a time, finding a quiet, meaningful purpose in the ruins of his former life. One sunny afternoon, he sat on a simple park bench, watching children play on a nearby lawn. He was not alone. Across from him, sipping a cup of coffee, was Sarah Croft. The anger in her eyes had long been replaced by a quiet, resilient peace. Beside her, no longer a solemn little girl, but a bright, smiling 12-year-old, was Lily. Their meetings had become a quiet, regular tradition, an unlikely friendship forged in the crucible of truth and forgiveness. "The university wants you to be a keynote speaker at their spring symposium," Sarah said, a small smile on her face. "They say your lectures are the most requested in the entire faculty." Arthur shook his head, a humble gesture that would have been unthinkable for the man he used to be. "All I do is tell Alistair's story," he replied. "He's the one they should be listening to." Lily, who had been listening quietly, looked up from her sketchbook. She looked at Arthur, her eyes still holding that same unnerving clarity, but now softened with warmth. "Are you happy now, Arthur?" she asked. A simple question that held the weight of their entire journey. Arthur looked at this young girl who had been the catalyst for the complete demolition and reconstruction of his life. He thought of his small apartment, his modest work, his quiet evenings. He thought of the absence of fear, the absence of lies, the absence of the tremor in his hand. He gave her the most honest answer of his life. "Yes, Lily," he said, his voice thick with a gratitude that was almost overwhelming. "I am." He stood up to leave, and Sarah gave him a warm, friendly nod. Before he turned to go, Arthur looked at Lily one last time. "Thank you," he said softly. "You saved my life." Lily smiled, a brilliant, knowing smile. "No, I didn't," she corrected him gently. "My dad did. He just needed someone to tell his story for him." Arthur Vance turned and walked away, his shadow long in the afternoon sun. He was not a titan or a king. He was not a visionary or a savior. He was something far more rare and valuable. He was a good man, a man who had descended into the deepest, darkest parts of his own soul and had emerged on the other side, not just healed, but whole. He was a man who was finally, truly, free. If you enjoyed this story, don't forget to subscribe to the channel to see more moving videos like this one. Leave a like to support us, and turn on notifications so you don't miss anything new. This helps us continue creating the best for you. See you in the next video.